taught with other teachers watching live, swarming around the classroom, or sometimes using video, and then they will all share it. They'll look back at the lesson and they'll look at how it's, whether it's been effective or not. And the key thing, as I keep banging on about, it's the students learning, not the teacher performance. It's a given in situations like this that they have such a high sort of level of teacher expertise that they don't need to be looking at teacher performance. They're just looking at strategies in order to teach this tricky concept. This is just the sort of original origins of lesson study in Japan and in the US. Another part of lesson study that lots of people use as well is the student voice, if you like. I suppose that's what we call it in this country. So students are questioned about their learning. What parts of the lesson did you find interesting? Which parts of the lesson do you think you learned most? And I've had varying success with different parts of student voice, and that's why I'm saying this is the model in Japan. This is where it originates. I think there are ways that you can take the elements of lesson study and use them in a way that actually works in a UK school or works for the school that you're in. The last part then, and this probably is the most important bit, is the reflection and the ongoing improvement. So the teachers will then reflect on student voice, on student outcomes, on attainment, and they'll get back together and collaborate and say what worked, what didn't work so well, what can we do to improve that. Again, it's very difficult because our system is very different to the model that we have perhaps in the UK. There is a huge amount of time allowed for CPD in some models in Japan and in the Far East, in Hong Kong especially. It's built into a teacher's timetable, time to collaborate with other teachers. And because we perhaps haven't always had that emphasis in our schools, it can be tricky, but I'll show you how we might be able to overcome that. But it has had huge impact and has done so significantly and consistently. So there must be something in it that I think is worth taking into our own classrooms. So the way that some schools, there is actually a lesson study website. You can go on, I think it's lessonstudy.org. But you can go onto that website and have a look at some of the ways that it's been used in the UK. So typically, the planning part is still there. So the teachers plan a lesson with key learners already in mind. Now the typical model for a lesson study might be that you work in a department and you've decided that you're going to do a lesson study and look at a lower ability student, a middle ability and a top ability student. And you might just look at how that lesson is for them. And that's certainly the way that we used the model when we first introduced it at my own school. So the planning is important. I mean, the first time that we did it with middle leavers, we were doing it across the curriculum. So we weren't looking at that key concept within a department, with subject specialism. We were looking at the teaching and learning more than anything. So I worked, for instance, with a geography teacher, and just sitting together, our first model involved 1 hour planning together, then 1 hour teaching, with him teaching and me observing with the 3 students that we'd identified. And then afterwards, I did speak to some of the students, the three key students, and then I went back to my friend and we sat down and talked about why that might be. Now for us, it was brilliant. We absolutely loved it, and we said, this is ace, this is so good. We've noticed so many things about these students. And because my colleague is a really very reflective teacher, he took everything that was said and he thought aloud, and then he went away again and thought, yeah, you're right, I don't allow enough time for independent work with the higher ability learners. So what can I do about that? And it made him really reflect. And we raved about this to middle management, and we said, let's do this with all middle managers. And then when we came back for the second round and said, how have you got on this term? So we did it over a half-term cycle and said, for now, just go to one colleague's classroom, work in pairs, work on something that you might like to help tweak. You won't have to worry about the subject content because it was cross-curricular. So in some ways, we were sort of moving away from that model that was used in Japan. We were mostly looking at how you could tweak your teaching for those students that you're not noticing. And we were thinking perhaps to start with, if you were same subject, you get caught too much up in the concepts and the subject. So we were just looking at these 3 students, and it's very revealing. So obviously we wrote about it, and when we came back for the half-term review, a lot of the teachers said, well, it was okay, it was fine, but we didn't do the planning bit because we didn't have time, so she just came to my lesson and looked at 3 of the students. Or it was great, we had time for planning, and they came in and watched the 3 students, it was great. I said, and then what happened? Well, we didn't have time to do the sort of reflection afterwards. And I thought, well, and a lot of teachers are coming back with this, so we thought this is actually unmanageable then, because we're actually asking teachers to use an inordinate amount of their planning time and their PPA time to take part in this. And it wasn't something that we could see working, so we started trying to tweak it in a way, because I was so convinced of its merit that I wanted to try and work around a way that we could use it. So the big things that I think lesson study benefit from is the main thing, especially in the climate that we have at the moment, is it's non-threatening for the teacher. So whoever you're working with, you're not assessing them in any way in their performance, you're looking at the students. And it does have a benefit actually on the teacher's performance, but it's done in such a way that it's non-confrontational. And I'll give you some examples of how we've used it in a little while. So it's a different way of observing lessons. It focuses on students that might otherwise be overlooked. So for me, it became less about your top ability student and your middle and your lower ability, and it became about key students that I was involved with at the time. So it might be FSM and pupil premium students. Why are these students not doing so well all the way across the board? Is there something about their behaviour really that we could hone in on and share some approaches? And then also it's brought up the whole idea of rhinos, which I'll talk about in a moment. So immediately it creates a collaborative approach to teaching and learning, because you're having to talk to colleagues about their lesson and you're having to talk about planning together. And I think if it can be absorbed into a cycle, and if you're realistically planning a programme of lesson study, which means that you understand the pressures that teachers are under time-wise as well, it can be very powerful, but it does need somebody to keep moving it on. And when it's not working, investigations as to why, and it soon became very apparent, oh well, I hadn't met to plan, and you think, well, you do need to do that bit, because it's actually really good. So it was actually coming up with some evidence, really, is what I was talking about in the keynote, finding some evidence first, and then being able to go back to leadership teams saying, look, this really works, I wonder if we could try and be a bit more flexible with some of the time that we allow teachers that are taking part in the studies. So, there are problems with it. It is a complete time sponge if you do it traditionally. I do think the Japanese model is fairly unmanageable. I think swarming classrooms with teachers with their clipboards just ain't how is it? And you do need commitment. It's very difficult if I run in and say, this is ace and we all ought to use it. And actually we have a number of people on that body that we've chosen that don't really see the point in lesson study. I think it needs to be willing and able contributors to start with, some volunteers. And the 3 bits are needed. Okay, the planning, the execution, and then the reflection afterwards, in whatever form you can make it manageable. So, as I said earlier on, it's a walk, get over it. And this is the way that I've suggested that we go through with this in lesson study at our school. So, it's a time sponge, so we start with small, using non-contact time, and use results to get more time. So you're working with evidence all the time. So it might just be a small body of you that are trying lesson study, and then you take that evidence back with you to present to leadership team to try and get some more time to allow to do that. Again, the Japanese model is fairly unmanageable. We have a fantastic resource at my own school at the moment, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it can be done in pairs or threes. Hopefully, if you've done any peer observations, or some schools have sort of triangulated observations, that's not too intrusive, and you can actually have two colleagues maybe sitting in on your lesson and watching different things. We've tried it a lot, how it worked really well with ITT, with some of our trainees, and saying, right, for this session we want you to go and work in your department on a lesson study, go and pick 3 students that are under retaining and get them to work in pairs. That's been fantastic use of time. Like I said before, much better to start with volunteers and work your way up. If you have a teaching and learning group, they're the ideal place to start. So you could say we're actually going to pilot this for a while. It didn't work when we imposed it on all middle leaders. So therefore we go back to the drawing board and say, okay, we're going to try it with the volunteers, with the teaching and learning group, because they're there voluntarily, hopefully, at your school. And it really does have to be, the 3 stages are non-negotiable. They have equal status. It can sometimes feel that it's all about the lesson. It's actually not all about the lesson. You can do the lesson observation in half an hour. You can go in and do it in half a lesson. The planning is equally as important, and the reflection is equally as important. So, last year I went to a lecture by Dr. Matt O'Leary, who's written a book about lesson observations at the moment. He's launching it at Walsall University. And he spoke with Professor John Elliott, who worked in the 60s and 70s on curriculum reform. And he was talking about working with David Blunkett actually in the 1980s, and Blunkett was very interested in a group of students that he felt were in every single school, and by the time they had reached, he reckoned about the age of 14, they had such a level of disaffection and disaffected behaviour and disengagement that the school did not have any pull for them anymore. Now these aren't necessarily students either who are failing. So if you think about your intervention programmes that you're probably being bombarded with at school at the moment, it's not those students that are doing really badly. These are the students who can do it and do just about enough, but don't actually achieve what they're capable of. And Blunkett actually called them rhinos, because he said, oops, they are really here in name only. They don't cause any problem when they're in your class. They're not the students that kick off. They're not the students that are attention seeking, probably far from it. They're polite and they get on with things, but they are just bubbling on that radar. So you never really take a huge amount of notice of them in the class. They're not the high achievers, but they're also not the worst offenders. And he said, there are key students. And immediately that actually rang a bell in our own school. We have, I suppose, an average intake of free school meal and pupil premium students and SEN students. We're probably above the national average for that. But we also live in a fairly nice, leafy, affluent area where the students are very, very nice, because they probably can't be bothered to play up in a lot of the lessons, because it's sort of, you know, there is this sort of level of apathy, I think, sometimes in the students that we have at our school. They are lovely. You could spend the day at our school and say they are the nicest students we've ever met, but there is this level of come and give it to me, come and find me, come and get it. And we knew that these were some of our really key under-retainers. So I thought, actually I'm going to have a look at rhinos. Now this is our secret weapon, our observation classroom, which I wrote about before Christmas. And some of the comments that I had in the Guardian comments were quite interesting. Big brother, this is oppressive, this is the most terrible thing I've ever seen in a classroom. Are you serious? Well, that's my classroom. I'm obviously on the other side. That's one of my colleagues looking through the two-way glass, and we have a room which is probably about the size of up to that pillar there, as a sort of viewing gallery. And we have chairs if you want to sit at the chairs. We call them our Westlife chairs because they're sort of a height. And we have a lounge type area as well for people to talk about there.